Welcome to the Provocative Parenting Podcast. I'm Brian,
I'm Alex.
and this is our guest, George Beden. He's joining us today with quite a legacy, being a World War II veteran, pilot, parent of multiple generations. And we're going to learn about that today.
Yeah, don't back.
Well, we'll get started. George Beden. I can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to this. It's such an honor to have you here in a lot of ways. I was telling Alex earlier how much of a nut I am for nostalgia, that my head half the time lives several decades ago. And so I'm a history nut, a World War II nut. So I was excited to have this conversation before I even knew it was going to be with you. But then after I met you, I was even more excited. So just, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
How far back do you want to go?
How far back do you remember?
Oh, I remember. I remember a long ways back. Believe me.
Well, let's start in the middle.
All right, that's a good start.
Yeah. Start with your service.
I remember when I was like one or two.
Oh, that's impressive.
I don't know. I started high school when I was 5 years old. High school. Started school when I was 5 years old, I'm sorry. And graduated when I was 16. And at 16, I had about 2 months, if I remember right, a couple of months to go before I had reached 17.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to be 17 to join the Conservation Corps. And so, because I was born in a very small town, about 500 population. It was a farm town. And so consequently, the Depression, which was on at the time, didn't really bother us much. It didn't change our life much because we just went, life kind of flowed and it never changed. When you're running a farm, it's day by day the same thing. No matter what happens to the world, you continue. And so I joined the CCC, spent a year. When I got out of that, I went to work for General Motors, Cadillac Motor Car Company in Detroit. And then the war broke out. So you'll have to know me a little better probably, but at 2:30 in the afternoon, I walked away from my machine, and the foreman stopped me at the door, and he said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going home." And he says, "Why, are you sick?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm sick of working here." And he says, "Well," he says, "you should work till 4 o'clock." I said, "No, I'm all done." And well, he says, "You coming back in the morning?" I said, "I doubt it." And I left, and I never went back. I went home and fooled around a little bit and went down and decided I'd join the Air Corps. Well, I took really about 2.5 days of physicals for the Air Corps, and they found out I had a heart murmur. The only time that anybody ever found out was my family doctor way back, but of course they found it.
Yeah.
And they said, "You can't fly the airplane." I said, "What can I do?" I said, "You can be a navigator." I said, "If I can't fly, I don't want nothing to do with it." So I just walked out the door, walked down 3 flights of steps, and joined the Navy. So, anyhow, do you want me to go on with that?
Well,
Or what do you want exactly?
we did find out that you did become a pilot, though.
Afterwards, I came home and took lessons, and I liked flying so well that I just spent a lot of my time at it, and eventually became a instrument rated and instructor and whatever.
And You have quite an impressive amount of hours logged in as a pilot, don't you?
I'm sorry.
You've logged a lot of hours.
Yeah, I can't remember. 8,000,
Yeah.
7, 6, 9. I don't know. A lot. Yeah, a lot of hours. Because I flew missionaries all over, everywhere. I flew a lot of weekends.
Yeah.
About every weekend for number of years, because I flew for three particularly missionary groups
Mhm.
out of Indiana, and they would call me sometime during the week and say, "Hey, the nice thing about flying was the missionaries is I would shut my work down at 5 o'clock on Friday and jump on the plane and fly to Indiana, generally, pick up my passengers, and then we'd set up at least 3 places to go because with a plane, of course, as you well know, you could reach them all. So Saturday morning we'd head out and usually hold a meeting um, within 200 or 300 miles, wherever it happened to be. And then we'd either have lunch and jump in the plane and fly another 200 or 300 miles and hold a meeting there. And then either stay overnight or fly to another one and stay overnight with someone and hold another meeting that morning. And that way I could head home by Sunday afternoon and be home with the family and usually go to church on Sunday night. And so that was my routine pretty much. Obvious not every weekend, but a lot of
Yeah.
weekends. And doing it that way, I could move a lot of miles. We could set up quite a few meetings and complete them and have some nice dinners and be on to the next one.
So one
So,
thing I'm curious about is when you enlisted. Um, I know I did the math. You just had a birthday 2 weeks ago. Turned 101. It's quite a feat. It's amazing. I mean,
uh,
you don't look a day over 70.
I don't feel a day over 20, so there you
Okay.
go.
So that would have put you would have turned 18 just a couple months before Pearl Harbor was attacked. Is that correct?
uh, you're better at math than I am.
Yeah.
Yeah,
If I tell you,
particularly
I
at this
could.
age, I can't. My mind's kind of like, a little bit like it.
So what I'm curious about is when you enlisted, was it before or after the U.S. Entered the war?
No, it was after.
Okay.
Yeah. I was working. We were turning out tanks at the time for England.
Okay.
Because you probably well know, the United States didn't dare do anything until we were in the war.
Yeah.
Our tanks, our planes were flown to Canada, to the international line between the United States and Canada. Then they were hooked on with a tractor and towed across so that they couldn't be flown across the border.
Huh.
And then they would get in and fly them to England.
Interesting.
Well, that's kept
Huh.
the legal
I see.
part of it out of. So we actually didn't fly any planes for the British. We flew them into Canada, and then they towed them across the border.
Okay.
And it was kind of interesting. In fact, I actually flew up there one time and just for the fun of it, and taxied my plane across the border. Those years afterwards.
Yeah.
So, if we use today's time, and today, the youth of today would get a vacation. Hey, there's a war starting. You got to protect your country or do something. What would be the difference today and then? What do you see?
You don't want to hear that. I I probably can explain it. First of all, the whole thing to me kind of depends on money.
Mm.
You have to remember that in 1941, the very end of the Depression, but the Depression was not over with. Nobody had any money. So joining the service did two things: gave you a job
Mm.
and gave you a few dollars. That actually gave you $30 a month, which in those days was a lot of money.
Mm.
Um, so I, that it's hard for me kind of to explain this, I guess, but if you see pictures of the guys that went in the service, then there is no heavy set. I mean, we were skinny, all of us, for a reason. Uh, Plus, it gave us all something to do. Plus, so I spent a year, as I told you, in civilian conservation.
Yeah.
Well, civilian, I don't know if you're aware of it, but civilian conservation was run by the Army.
Okay.
So when we were in camp, it was kind of like being in the Army. We wore Army uniforms, old World War I uniforms, actually.
Okay.
We mustered in the morning, we went through all the routine kind of that the Army did. And then we went to work, and we worked all day. The camps did different things. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but just about every tree that you see in the United States today was planted by the CCC back in the 30s.
Mm.
Because they had just about mowed all the trees down in the United States by the turn of the century and made lumber out of it. So
Yeah.
there was very few trees. All these trees as you travel south that you see alongside the road, the forests and so on, they were flat. That was all, I
Wow.
guess you'd call it grazing land. There was no trees.
Mm.
And all these trees have been grown since then. Um, it's, I don't know how to put this, but back at that time when the war started, every boy, old and we had one boy that was 15 years old that joined the service.
Yeah,
He fought on Guadalcanal.
So how do you get away with that?
They weren't too fussy about asking your age during the war.
So you could just kind of say
And
whatever.
he was a big kid.
Okay. So he could pass for an older guy.
Yeah, and in fact, he's a good friend of ours. He just passed away a couple of years ago.
Okay.
And what he did, they found he fought in the Battle of Guadalcanal.
Wow.
And they found out he was 15. They said, you can't be in this. Well, he joined the Marines. They said, you can't be in the Marines. He said, well, I am. Well, they said, we're going to discharge you. So they discharged him. So he came home. And if I remember right, I think he joined the Army. He went right down, joined the Army, and he served somewhere in the Army until they found out how old he was then. They discharged him again, so he joins the Merchant Marines.
Okay.
And he ended up his life in the Merchant Marines. But we had a lot of 15, 16, 17. During the war, they weren't fussy about your age, really.
Yeah.
We had a lot of 17-year-olds. I remember a lot of 17-year-olds got in 17 at 17 at that time you could get in with the consent of your parents.
Okay.
And a lot of parents gave their consent. But there are an awful lot of guys that just simply wrote their parents' name down on it, and they in those days they didn't ask questions. They just if you could get in, you were in.
So, outside of the incentive for a job and decent pay, what would you say the difference was with young men then versus young men now in terms of the willingness to step up and do
I
something
can
like
tell
that?
you that real quick. When I graduated from high school, there was not one boy or girl that I graduated with that couldn't wait to graduate and go get a job,
Mm.
go to work. Nobody, I don't know of anybody that stayed home the day after they graduated. All of us want to get out and get on our own. Now, I have to this is, you have to understand, it's even hard for me, not hard for me to understand, it's not hard for me to understand, but I think it is today.
Mm.
And that is, we didn't leave home because we didn't like home.
Right.
Everybody, every one of us that I know had good home lives, a lot better than today by far. They were all taken care of by their parents. They all had work that they did around the farms and whatever and so on. I don't know. It's hard to explain. Um,
Well, let's.
it's a money thing. I mean, I don't care how you look at it. It's money. We didn't have any money,
Mm.
and that had a lot to do with it. And yet, there was a home life. Most families were anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 children. There were big families in those days, and so yeah. And if you look at it this way, I've often thought about it. You stop and look at it, and you say, "Oh my gosh!" Just like you guys, my family, they had 15 kids. Well, you got to realize there wasn't that many at home at that time. The older ones were grown up, married, and gone.
I got you. Yeah.
So there's only really 4 or 5 children at home at the time. But what first thing people ask me when I say this, they go, 15? But you got to remember,
They weren't all there at the same time.
no, at the
Yeah.
time, but by the time the oldest son was probably married and had children the same age as his younger brother.
Yeah.
You know, actually,
My oldest daughter is that way. My wife was pregnant with our first at the same time her mom was pregnant with her last.
absolutely.
And so she has an uncle that's
And believe it
younger.
or not, in those days that was not uncommon. I mean, today it's uncommon. In those days, that was very common. All of my relatives, almost everybody I knew, had at least 5 or 6 kids, and a lot of them. I married a girl that had 13 brothers and sisters, and that 10, 12, 13 was not unusual in those days. That was then.
So let's talk about that component of a family dynamic. Is there something about having that large of a family that contributes to a different mindset that families and kids have then than today?
Absolutely.
What would you say it is?
Well, there's so many things that add into it, but if you want one basic factor, to me, is money. We didn't have any money.
Mm.
Now today, people, as I said before, I didn't know one kid, boy or girl, that stayed home or lived at home after they graduated. They all went out and got a job. Now today, almost everybody I know has got children living home. And that in my day, that was just not, you just didn't, period. That was it. So it gave you a mindset. You were almost an adult when you graduated.
Mm-hmm.
These children today are never adults. I don't care if they're 30, 40, 50, 60. They never reach adulthood. I don't know, frankly, in my opinion, I know very few so-called adults that are really adults
Mm-hmm.
because they don't have, it's hard to explain. Again, that drive
Yeah.
to go out on your own and do your thing, become an individual, not one of a clan or a group or a whatever. You went out, you became yourself, an
Yeah.
individual, and you ran your life. Nobody else. You were in control of it from the time you were roughly 17 years old on up. You were in control of your life. You weren't running home to Papa and Mama for anything. I don't know anybody I honestly don't know anybody that I grew up with that went back home for anything except to visit.
Yeah.
That's all. I mean, they never went back home for anything. Well, but I understand too that nobody had anything.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't go back to Papa and Mama for money because they didn't have any.
So speaking,
So
if so, like it there. So what I'm hearing is when when money is tight, you know, when you grow up and you don't have much, when someone was reaching that early adulthood stage, there was probably a sense that they didn't want to further be a burden on their parents
exactly,
when they had the capability of standing on their own 2 feet. Is that what you're
exactly,
saying?
exactly. Every child. Well, at that time, at 17, you were no longer a child,
Yeah.
boy or girl. You left home and you went out and you made your own way. And it's one of those things that's hard to describe because the way the society is today, I think people think that um, the parents were trying to get rid of them or something. It's not true. I mean, there was a love there that's not here today.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, to me, there is no real love generally between parents and child. Most parents today, I say most, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of parents today, maybe most, their children are something that comes and let's get rid of them as soon as we can.
Mm-hmm.
That's my opinion. That's the way I see it. That's why it's so hard to explain that when I was a child, we couldn't wait to get away from home. But it was not because we didn't love home or our parents. It was simply because we wanted to get out and do our thing.
Yeah.
You know, get on our own. And every one of us came back home to visit and so on and so forth, and they were our parents. But we didn't come back home to live off them.
Yeah.
We came back home to visit them. And that was it. And that, to me, that's the basic difference. Today, the best way I can explain it, the way I see it, is that children just never grow up. There is no such thing as an adult today.
Yeah.
I mean, I shouldn't say that. There are some, but
I know what you mean, though.
basically, there are no adults. They're all probably an example to me is that in those days you hardly ever heard of divorces. That was very rare. There's probably a couple reasons for that. One reason was the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
A woman at that time couldn't go out and get a job. She couldn't go out and do this and go out and do that. She was pretty much a housewife and a mother. Today, they can get out and do almost anything. In fact, a lot of them are in jobs they can't even handle because they're women. The military, for instance.
Yeah.
That's the worst place in the world for a woman, but they got them. They got to have them. And a lot of other places, they're not physically, obviously,
Yeah.
fitted to those jobs. Where in those days, and I'll admit, it has its kind of probably bad things about it, in that women couldn't get out and do their thing. A lot of women, particularly in my day, if the husband died, which in my day, that there were quite a few women that had 3 or 4 husbands, or 2 or 3 or whatever, because a lot of men died early, and most men died before, which I pretty much, I guess today, I've kind of watched the statistics, and the women live 2 or 3 years longer than men today even.
That is true. Yeah.
But in those days, but a lot of women died in childbirth and whatever too in those days. So I knew quite a few men that had remarried and remarried a couple of times. But I don't know. I just of course, a lot of it was too. It just kind of burned me, but in my day, you were used to getting up in the morning and going to work at dawn and going home at dark.
Yeah.
And today, even right now, I'm watching on the television, and they're trying to get even less hours now than what they work already. Nobody works today, so I don't know what they're going to do. But everybody I know worked from dawn till dark, and it was just the way of life. That's what you did. And of course, once again, remember, I lived in a farming community, so that's what it was, a dawn to dark, sometimes 24-hour job.
You mentioned that in, where you grew up, the farming community, so there wasn't a lot of noticeable difference growing up in the Depression versus not. But outside of your community, I mean, if you could have a window back then, I mean, what was the overall climate like in the home as a result of the Depression?
Well, I think I can give you a good example. My dad spent 11, 12 years in the Philippines. I don't know how long. He was under old Arthur MacArthur, and he came home in 1919. Of course, the World War was over with, World War One, and he married my mother in 21. I was born in 23. I was the oldest, and but Dad immediately went to work, and like I said, Dad was, even for that day, a little bit, and for this day, completely unusual, in that he worked up within probably 4 or 5 years to where he owned a business and a farm, and I think he had a logging business besides. He bought 3 businesses, and for that day and age, that was extremely unusual. But my dad was a worker.
Yeah.
I hardly ever seen him. He would go to work early in the morning before I got up to go to school, and come home late at night. And that was except Sundays. He was a very religious man. Sundays was no work, whatever. And but he did build up a big business for that day and age. Compared to everybody else, we were one of the more wealthiest people in town. Which, when I say wealthy, you got to understand what wealth at that time was. I mean, if you had a couple dollars, you was wealthy,
Yeah. Okay.
you know. So, but that's the way I grew up. But now you're talking about, we lived roughly about 25 miles from Flint, Michigan. And of course, as you well know, Flint's General Motors.
Mm.
And Dad, when he came home from the service, he went to work for General Motors, but he only worked, well, he worked a couple of years for him, and then he quit and started his own business. But while he was starting his business, he would work. At that time, he could go into the shop and work 3 or 4 months in the wintertime. And then he'd quit and go home and do his own business. And then when winter come, he'd go back to the shop and go to work. But he was, might have been because he was working tool and die, which is, even at that time was kind of a specialist, you know, business. He wasn't working on the line. And so they would hire him back. And but during the Depression, particularly through the 30s, all through the 30s, we had guys coming out to our place when they could borrow a car, because most of those guys had lost their cars, lost their houses. We had several people that Dad worked with in the shop in the early 30s who had lost their homes and lost everything, and had children, and were living with their mother-in-laws or father-in-laws or whatever, or mothers and fathers. And when they could borrow a car, they'd come out to our place, because Dad also had the farm. Well, we had a big orchard. We had an acre of orchard and an acre of garden. And so people would come out from Flint who had nothing, and Dad would just fill up their cars with potatoes and tomatoes and corn and whatever, you know, so they could eat next week. And so we had a lot of friends coming out from the city every weekend and getting enough groceries to go through the week. So that was a lot of my life too, and that probably also shows the difference between city life and the country life.
Yeah.
We were able to do this when these people in the city had lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost their cars, lost everything. And actually the small farmers were feeding them, a lot of them. So that's the kind of life I remember. My life was pretty good, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
You know, and but when I stop and think back, we had a couple. Actually, we had out of our in our town, we had two families that were. If I remember right, both of the husbands were incapacitated. One had, I think, tuberculosis. Anyhow, they couldn't work. So, and I compared again to today. I don't even know my next door neighbor. In those days, the town took care of them. Every day, people from town would go down and take down bread and milk and whatever, food for the families. And that's just the way you did it.
Mm.
And it was a kind of life where people took care of each other.
Yeah.
Today, you don't even know your next door neighbor.
What do you think have caused it to change?
Money. Money. We didn't have any money, so we took care of each other. Today, people that don't have any money can go to government and get a handout.
Mm.
Couldn't do that then. There wasn't any such thing. You didn't get a handout from the government in those days. If a neighbor didn't take care of you, nothing. Because there was nothing. You got to remember, I think it was 34, 35 before Social Security or whatever came along. See, there was no such thing like that. So if you didn't have any money, didn't have any way to make any money, you didn't go to government because they were not going to give you any anyhow. Up until probably the middle 30s, but the early, my dad, because being self-employed, at first couldn't even get Social Security. They would not give it to self-employed. All they were giving it to was these guys that were laid off from shops and whatever.
Okay.
Sometime along, I don't remember, but I'm going to say late 30s, they opened it up so that businessmen could get Social Security. And I still remember my dad had to, I don't know if this, it went something like this. He had to work like 4 or 5 years, and he had to put double or triple whatever every month into Social Security to catch up with what he didn't get, I guess,
Okay.
before. That's kind of the way it worked. Now, I still remember Dad getting up the money to so that he could finally, after, it wasn't very long, I think 4 or 5 years, and then he could draw his Social Security. But in the meantime, it was kind of rough getting that extra money so you could get up into that category.
Mm.
But of course, they finally made it. By the war, I think about it, you were going to find about everybody was on Social Security by that time. But I can't remember if they took it out. I don't think they took it out of my paycheck in the Navy. I'm pretty sure they didn't. I don't know how that worked. I'm lost on that one.
Now, you just explained a little bit of story of how you grew up with your dad. Now, a little later, you became a dad. What was different?
Well, I was like my father. I only spoke to my kids once. I'll never remember. I'll never forget the kind of coming home from work. And of course, I worked 6 days a week, just like my dad, 9 hours a day, all the time. And I had a good business. For that time, well, by the time I was in my 30s, I had my home, I had my car, I had my airplanes, I had all paid for. I didn't owe anybody anything.
Mm.
And I was totally debt-free. And my kids, I don't know. I guess the best way I can tell it is I kind of remember coming home from work one night, usually late, and my wife, my first wife, they come out and she said, "Gerald, it did so and so. You got to do whatever." And I just took her and I said, "Look, I wasn't there. You were there. You're the one that tells him he did wrong, not me. Not at this time. He's forgot it already."
Yeah.
I said, "You are telling him." I said, "Don't you ever meet me at the door coming from work and tell me that the kids did this or the kids did that. I don't want to hear it." So that's the way I handled mine. That was the end of that. I did, um, my oldest boy, I never had any trouble with my kids. My my oldest daughter and my third child were my kind of my problems, and my son and my youngest daughter were no problem at all. My youngest daughter, if I said a harsh word to her, she'd break out in tears. You know, my oldest daughter was a little stiffer than that. She's a little tougher, but right now I don't regret anything I did. I brought my family up the way they're all good kids to this day. Well, I don't have all of them now. Some of them passed away, but uh, they and my grandchildren and my great grandchildren and my great greats and my great whatevers. Right now, the last one that got in trouble and was in trouble for a long time. I only had two of my descendants out of all of my kids and grandkids and whatever that got in trouble. Only two. And the one got out of it in a hurry. And right now I don't know, he owns homes all over the country. And I don't really know what he does. I know he owns a whole bunch of stuff. And he's whatever. And my other grandson, who got into drugs, very young, got into drugs and had a long, hard, rough time with it. But probably 5 years ago or so, he just got out of it and got married a nice girl and got a little boy. And as far as I know, so I have at this point in time, cross my heart. No, all of my grandkids, great grands, and great greats, and whatever are doing well.
It's a good legacy.
Yeah, and which makes me, of course, I have to admit, it's all of them been brought up in the church. They're all, as far as I know, every one of them are good Christians, and
That's a question I had. A comparison to today. Like when you were growing up, what percentage of people around you attended some type of church versus
almost
today?
everybody. Almost everybody. Very few. We had now talking about my small town, of course. Of course, you got, part of it, I think, was the times.
Yeah.
And you have to remember, too, that the churches at that time the churches and the schools were the centers of the community. That's where everything happened, where everybody got together, churches, the schools. So there's no way that you could jump into your car and drive 100 miles or 200 or 300 and have a party. I mean, it just didn't happen.
Yeah.
In fact, well, I think I told you, my aunt and uncle lived north of us about, I don't know, 70 or 80 miles. It took us all day to get there. So you'd start out in the morning. We always carried 2 shovels because you knew he was going to get stuck about 15 times.
Oh, wow.
So, well, there was no paved roads. It was all the last probably 30 or 40 miles up to my uncles and aunts and cousins in the north woods was just 2 trails through the woods. And I mean, wasn't even a road. It was kind of a track, and thinking about that, my cousins who lived in northern Michigan, my uncle, now I'm talking about the 30s to the 30s, was still clearing land. He was still digging up stumps and making stump fences. And of course, there was no vehicles. He had a team of oxen, and that's what he farmed with.
Mm.
And they lived almost all of my cousins in northern Michigan lived in one-room houses, and almost all of them had 12 or 14 children. And I said a house.
Yeah.
Actually, it was a one-room building in the middle of the woods. And when you walked in, you walked between beds. like this, just all beds. And the kitchen was a lean-to built on the outside. That's where all the cooking was done. And then it was taken in the house, and you sat on the beds and ate. And that's the kind of life that northern Michigan was like back in the 30s. And all the houses were built about 2 to 3 feet above the ground, because that's where all the cattle stayed, underneath.
Huh.
And that kept the house nice and warm in the wintertime.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, almost all the houses, all the cabins up there were built up off the ground, and you drive the cows in the wintertime, and that's where they lived down there. The cows and horses and pigs and whatever lived underneath the house. And you didn't have to go far. You're living now, if you can picture Michigan, the lower half of the mitten was kind of populated in a way. But then when you went north, they were living up, most people up there were living like they'd lived for 200 years. I mean, they were living in cabins and making some kind of a living out of the woods.
Yeah.
And there were very few people up there at the time, really. There are not many. But my uncle and aunt moved up there back in right around the turn of the century, and simply hacked their way out of the woods. So you guys aren't too far removed from that,
Right.
from that age, really. And but I don't know how to answer your other question, because you're not going to like what I say. People today are, in general, first place, they don't know anything. They're totally ignorant about life. I mean, they can do this if that means anything, but need to talk to my wife, because we hired, what the heck did we? We had the store. We hired that girl from the college up here, didn't we? We hired some girl from the college. She was graduating, right? Yeah.
Blank.
She tried to work with her for a while, and I think the only reason they put them through college is that they have them too long. They have them 2 years in one grade, and that's long enough. So we move them up and get them out.
Now, speaking of that, as parents, right, we're all young parents right now.
Yeah.
And what concerns me, what can I do to raise my children in a way where they can withstand difficult times and moments and still keep that family unity and love and care about other people?
Well, you can. It's difficult, because obviously they're out here, totally surrounded by. But I do know people. Yes, we have a kid that works for us that does our lawn, and I don't know. I don't even know his parents. I don't know. But anyhow, he is the most polite, nicest speaking, educated. We found one after trying a dozen or two.
But it sounds like what you're saying, and I would agree with this, that maybe harsher than usual conditions or some sort of adversity growing up with kind of conditions you in a way to be more prepared as an adult. Would that be a way to put it?
Yes. I don't, frankly, I don't know how they did it with things the way they are. But I'm not, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying every kid, I don't know every kid, but I do know some that are really, I consider nice kids. That they're gonna go. I hate to say this, but I got two great grandsons right now. In fact, the one just entered into college of the Ozarks. And if you're aware of what they're,
Yes.
and in fact, I think his brother's going to go in next year. So they're
They have a hard work ethic.
that, and I don't know how you explain. I don't know how you do it. Difficult question. But I, I know kids like the kid that does our lawn. Lovely personality, knowledge, whatever. I don't know his parents, so I can't say, but I'm sure his background, whatever. And I know they exist, but um, to keep them completely out of the world, I guess you'd say, I don't know. I don't think you can do it, but you have you somehow, obviously, in your personality and in your home life,
Yeah.
you can still ingrain those feeling of self-worth
Yeah.
and so on. I think it's hard. It's hard. It's harder than it ever was because
Because we have a lot of things easy. Like
yeah,
you mentioned before, money is a big thing. So when there's not a desperate need for money, because most people live pretty comfortably, even our poorest live, from what it sounds like, a lot more comfortably than what you saw growing up, because
well,
of
yeah,
you know
yeah.
gov-
They've
government support is there for most everybody in a way that kind of eliminates a lot of the want
Right.
or
Right.
yeah.
When we have to survive, you have to feed the family.
yeah.
You'll go out of your
You're
way.
that's another thing. I don't know that I mentioned it. Anyhow, the you got to love your kids, and if you can show that,
Hmm.
most people don't. I say most people. A lot of people that I know don't. In fact, a lot of them I know wish their kids were somewhere else. But um, that's the basis. I mean, you got to love your kids. You got to let them know that you love them.
Mm.
Um, my dad was a very strict man. He had laws. He laid them down. You better believe them. But if I got in trouble at school, the last person they could call all the policemen in the world. I don't care. I didn't ever want them to call my dad. Ever, never. That was the kind of, I don't know how you explain that. That's just how it was, and yet I loved him. There was a, I knew that what he was doing was for my benefit
Yeah.
somehow. I don't know how you, well, that's the way you raise your family. I mean, you can do it today, I know, because there are kids that way.
Yeah.
Now, how in the world they do it, I don't know. With this mess it is, most of them are so empty-headed out of the school. But no, there are some nice kids out there, and I think basically you have to show them that you love them. You've got to have that. I mean, you can't keep pushing them off the side and saying
Yeah.
whatever. They
Part of showing that you love them is to have strict guidelines and boundaries.
Exactly.
Because without that tight barrier, there's that kind of creates a little bit of uneasiness with a kid's upbringing.
You know what? My wife and I, we used to, we'd come back from the store, and you see people going down the store with a couple of kids,
Yeah.
and the kids over there. One thing we never did when we went in the store is touch anything on the aisles. My dad was death on that. You didn't touch nothing.
Yeah.
Today, kids go down there and pick up everything and play with it. And the one woman stands up and says, "Don't do that, don't do that, don't do that." She says, "Don't do that 85 times," and the kid knows it don't mean nothing.
Yeah.
You know how many times I would have said it? I didn't even say it once because I knew better.
Yeah.
So the point is, you love your kids, but you lay down the rules and you abide by them.
Mm-hmm.
You don't, when you make a rule, that kid's got to know that that rule is a rule that's don't change. That's it. And of course, a lot of it, well, no, it's not. I don't know. I can't say that either. I was going to say it's hard to do if a kid's living at home, but it isn't. Even a child living at home, there are rules, and you set those rules, and they don't change. They don't change. In particular, well, I know I told you about my daughter the first time she.
Yeah, you mentioned that when you were visiting at our house. You can share it again here.
Yeah, my oldest daughter, the first time that she rebelled, and she walked in the house, and I had built a new house, my second house, and of course all the doors locked, and so she locked the door to the bedroom, and I just put my foot against it and kicked the whole door in, and of course I had to fix it. But I made my point. She never locked the door again.
Yeah.
And that I think that's probably the basic point of everything with raising a child is that lay down the law. The law has got to be a reasonable law. I mean, you don't run around telling them, don't do this, don't do that. That's another thing I hate. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. Don't do things that are important. Unimportant things just because they're bothering you, forget it. I mean, but lay down the laws and stick by them.
Yeah.
And just make sure that child does that. And if you have, of course, it's kind of hard to do. If you brought that child up from, I think once you get past that 2 or 3 years or 4 years old, if you haven't started it by then, you might as well forget it.
Yeah.
But if they've grown up knowing love in the home, knowing that there's that reasonable rules and regulations that they have to abide by, I don't care what.
Yeah.
And I told my son one time, and they all knew that. I told him, I said, you don't own this. This is not your home. You're just living here. I own the home. He don't own that home. You don't do everything you want to do. You do what I tell you to do. And when you grow up, get growing up and ready to leave the house, do whatever you want to.
That's interesting because that almost couples really well with what you had said before about there being like all your friends that you knew, whether boy or girl, when they were 18, they were ready to leave the house because they were kind of ready to assume that same responsibility. They didn't have a freeloader's mindset, and
Yeah.
they're ready to have something to call their own because they didn't at that time.
No, That's exactly right.
That is a different mindset than we see
Yeah,
today.
they had to go out and do it
Right.
themselves. Today, everything's given to them. So I understand that, and that, well, that shouldn't be, but that's the way it is. Um, again, it it is so obvious. Just go into Walmart
Yeah.
and watch those kids. That would never happen in my day. I never saw a kid touch anything. You don't touch nothing on the store. And but well, I probably said this before, but who the heck was it? The guy wrote a book in the '70s. What the heck was that? What was his name? Anyhow, but here here's the answer to the whole thing right here in that book. Back before the war, the parents ruled the house. After the war, the children rule the house,
Mm.
which is true, pretty much.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things that play into that, I'm sure. And so one thing I was thinking of, and you can kind of give me a contrast to this, but we have a generation now that is increasingly, self-centered, self-focused, self-interested, um, and and really everybody's born that way, like without any intervention from a parent or a guide in some way. That's just how everybody's going to end up, because we're born selfish. And so one thing you could speak to is, you mentioned about what the average size was of families back then.
Mm-hmm.
My theory is, because I've got a pretty large family, and we saw how things changed from when we had 2, 3, 4 kids,
Oh,
and then
yeah.
up when we got more than that. The dynamic at home got easier with more
Absolutely.
kids,
Yeah.
and just my perspective of looking back on it wasn't something we necessarily tried to do, but the whole concept of teaching selflessness to a child became easier when there were more of them at home,
Mm-hmm.
because there was no possibility for any one kid to get too much individual attention.
Right.
And
Yeah.
when I say individual attention, I mean like in the kind that's too flattering.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and you tell me what you think about this. I kind of equate it to the military in some ways. You get an 18-year-old kid, goes into the military, typical, just not mature, not grown up all the way. But by the time they get through, maybe even just boot camp, but at the very least, all 4 years of it, they're a different person, because they were put in an institution or a situation where there was no possibility for them to be the center of attention. They became part of a team, part of a unit, and you had to work together, and you were just in an environment where the performance was based on collaborative effort.
Yeah. That you're
And
right. You're
and
right.
there was a sense of that when we got
Yeah.
above 4
Yeah.
kids. It got
Yeah.
easier.
That's a lot of it. Somehow, if you ingrain into a child that you work as a unit
Hmm.
rather than an individual, uh, and then what you do affects that person,
Yes.
and that affects that person to what they do to you
Hmm.
or with you. And that's very true. In fact, it's funny that came up because I'm just reading a book about that. Those Marines that were killed over in Afghanistan, the only survivor, he wrote a book, and that perfect example of that. Those guys worked as a unit, and right down to the last thing, you know.
Can you share a little bit of that?
Hmm?
Can you share some of what
Well,
comes to mind?
you probably don't, maybe don't, but it was on the news. It was in the probably 10 or 15 years ago. There was the group of Marines. I think there was 8 of them, but they were sent into Afghanistan or something. Anyhow,
Yeah.
they got surrounded, and um, all of them got killed but one, and and the only reason that he survived was because they fought as a unit. They were completely surrounded by the Taliban for several days, and just totally wiped out. Except he was the only one that survived. But the reason he survived was that they would never have lasted that long without working as a total unit, and everything they did, everything was, everything I do depends on what you do, so
Yeah.
on. And it's quite a book. And I can't remember his name, but it's a good example of working together and taking care of each other.
Yeah.
And you're right, the military, that's the way it is. Well, it is the military, even if you're not in combat, and you depend on each other. You better depend on each other, because you're the only one there, you know.
Yeah. And if somebody tries to do something selfish or something that's just their own thought, it
Yeah.
affects an entire system.
Well, you're such a unit that anything that affects this guy affects you, whether you know it or not. It does.
Mm.
You know, you're over here. I'm um, I've been there.
Yeah. And
So
and what I was saying is not to say that you can't achieve that same level of selflessness and respect for your sibling or neighbor. It's just a little tougher, I think, when there's maybe one or two kids at home. It just makes
oh
your
yeah,
job as a parent is going to be
absolutely,
it's just that much
absolutely.
harder. Not that you can't do it, but it's a little more difficult.
Well, I got a good example in my family. Cousin Paul. My cousin Paul was an only son.
Hmm.
My uncle Elwood was one of the richest men in Chicago. He had an office on the top floor of the Richter building back in the 30s. He owned most of the Loop.
Hmm.
Paul had everything he wanted anytime, but my aunt brought that kid up to obey, to be polite. We should have brought that. He just passed away. He was ended up a professor of music at DeLand University down in Florida.
Okay.
And you ought to read his
Bio
yeah, it
or obituary.
yeah. The kids just loved him. He was just it says one of the most, what's it say, one of the most honored or loved professor in the history of the college, and he was an only son.
And I've met people like that too. I'm
Yeah,
sure you have too. There are those gems that
yeah.
people that just
It,
stand out, but again, it has to do with the parents just instilled something very unique in them.
well, my aunt,
So I see love and rules. I
Love
see.
and rules.
So far, that's what I read. From the whole conversation, you gotta love your kids, but they have to be rules. They have to
that's
abide by.
exactly right. You're exactly right, and you've got to do it for their benefit, not yours.
Wow, that's good.
Whatever you're doing
That's really good.
Yeah.
is for their benefit. That's what you got to remember. That's why you can't stand there and keep hollering at the kid. You tell them one time, do this, and they know that you're telling them because it's for their good, not because you're hollering at them. But that's the way it is. That's the way it should be, and that's
Now, on that thought, you said you have to do what you're doing for them and not yourself. Do you see some forms of discipline, or rather, when a parent withholds discipline, that they're actually doing it for their own benefit rather than the child? Because it's not fun to discipline somebody or to enforce certain rules. It's easier, actually, just
Yeah.
to kind of pull back. And I kind of see that there's an element of selfishness with making rules laxed or not carrying out discipline on a child, because it's that's the harder part of parenting. So, I don't know, what's your opinion on that?
Well, I don't think it's that hard. In the first place, which I should have added, I guess, you don't discipline the kid for every time he drops something on the floor.
Right.
The only time you discipline a child is when it's learning for him. He does something that's actually wrong.
Defiance.
Not that it disturbs you, but it's wrong for him, not you,
Yeah,
but for him.
that's good.
That's the point. Not that maybe you're unhappy. That's tough. If it's whatever he's doing is not hurting you a bit, that's tough. But if it's hurting him or his brothers and sisters or somebody else, that's different. So I guess my answer for the whole thing is you discipline your kids very little,
Yeah,
not hardly ever.
yeah,
Because when you tell them whatever you're disciplining them for, it's not only just for that situation, it's for this here, where they know that this is not right for them, not for anybody else. It's just not the thing to do,
yeah,
and it has nothing to do with you, really. It really doesn't. It has to do with what he's doing or she's doing that is harmful to them or somebody else, and that's difficult. But you don't. Too much discipline is no discipline.
yeah. Because they'll just rebel.
Don't
That's a
mean
good point.
anything after
That's a
all.
good point.
Mm.
Now, I'm raising 4 boys.
You're what?
I'm raising 4 boys. And what I realized and what I have been observing around us is that overall in the world, the masculinity is kind of being lost, right? So what do we do, or what does it take for boys to grow up a man?
Well, first of all, each one of them is an individual. And there's no way you can approach, in a lot of things, you can't approach them as a group. Because each individual has certain things. Like my second boy, he was a problem. I mean, and it's hard to do, but you have to treat them as an individual, and for take into consideration, I guess, somehow, how they're going to receive what you're trying to do for them. And every individual is different. I mean, you can't walk up to this kid here and chastise him for something that he's doing, and do the same thing for this one over here because he's somebody else, you know. And it always was that way. I don't know. It's hard, but basically, just basically, you have to do it without letting your feelings enter into it.
Mm.
That's that. As far as I'm concerned, that's probably the main thing. Forget the kid's doing something over here. Right away, you're going to get disturbed. You can't be disturbed. You got to go over there and look at that. What he's doing is wrong, and do it from that point, not from yours, from
So
his.
keeping emotion out of it.
You know,
That's a tall order for today's culture.
oh boy.
Because everybody's emotional.
Yes, it is. I know, I've been there. But as much as you can, that's what you have to do.
Yeah.
You have to stay out of it. You got to remember you're not the kid's jailer. You're raising this child. You know.
Yeah.
That and what you want him to be is what you should be trying to do, and it's hard.
Yeah. Something I thought of earlier, we were talking about military and kids going through boot camp or whatever. What do you see? Can you talk about some differences you see from your early military experiences and training and boot camp versus what you know of how it's run today?
Well,
And you don't have to be nice.
no, it's I don't know how to answer that. It's kind of of course you have to remember in the military you're raising rank all the time.
Yeah.
So that's hard to keep into consideration because when you're down here, you're nothing. And as you raise up, you're slowly getting control over these people here. And so you have to be, and that's hard to do, is to be consistent with the situation, whatever it is, you know, especially as you get higher up. And it seems like you see more too when you're up here than you do down here. But I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. You pretty much have got to treat people the way you want to be treated if you were in their position. I think.
Yeah.
I've got two nephews that lived right next door to me, and I don't want to make this sound like it's going to sound, but it's probably the way it's going to sound. But those two kids were up to my place just about every day. It was actually just across the field, actually. They lived in this farm, and I lived this one in the corner up here. And my brother-in-law, their dad, was a nice guy, one of my best friends, but he was a carpenter, and a good one, excellent carpenter. And he just hated to have his kids touch his tools or, you know, do anything like that. And I let him come up to my house and use everything I had. And had Elvin actually come up one day and he said, "Boys, you can't let those kids do that. They're going to get hurt." I said, "Okay, they get hurt once, they won't get hurt the second time, you know." And so actually, both of those kids put themselves through college by being welders because they learned to weld. I taught them to weld. And it's just, the point is, I guess, the things that you do like that helps these kids to get some knowledge and to learn to do things, and they know that, well, every now and then they come to me and just almost thank me for me doing that for them, because they got good jobs and got good families and whatever. And once again, I don't want it to sound like it's sounding, but that's it. It just the more you help people and show them the right thing to do, that's going to show up eventually. And again, with you, you got 4 boys. I feel for you. That's why I got. People are individuals. I don't care. They're all different. You got 4 boys, but it's one family. But as you well know, they're not all the same.
All right, let's switch real quick to the respect of a woman.
Pardon?
The respect of a woman, a wife in the home or a woman at work. How was it then and how is it now?
Well, of course, when I was a kid, a woman at work was the only jobs that women could have would be like secretaries, or a bookkeeper.
How different were ladies or women treated, and how different was the behavior of the typical girl growing up versus a girl today?
Oh, totally different. Complete turnaround. They I kind of believe in the Bible. I think a woman has her place. I still believe a man is the head of the family. I really do. You can not necessarily because he's a man, but you can, in any business, anything you do, you only have one head. You can't have more than 40 of them. You have one that makes the decisions eventually in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way it is in the military. That's the way it is in life, in a business, or anywhere else. You got somebody at the top.
Yeah.
And it kind of keeps things leveled off. You haven't got 2 people up here arguing about what's going to happen. It might be wrong, but nevertheless,
Yeah.
it stops it. And that's so. But there again, you have to use that in a reasonable manner. I mean, that don't mean you're boss. That just means that you got the ability to stop all the problems and all the difficulties and whatever, hopefully. And that's the way I think it should be. I always thought. And of course, most people want to take that, particularly today. Oh boy. And that's a terrible thing, but I don't think it is. I think it's biblical, and I think that's the way it's supposed to be. And generally, well, when I was growing up, we just didn't have all this. I mean, the man was the head of the family, and maybe he was wrong, make any difference. But nevertheless, you got to remember that when he's making this decision, which most people today seem to think you're making it for this person, that actually they're making it for everybody down here. And it's...
And if something blows up, he takes responsibility.
Exactly.
And not the other people.
That's right. And it's, well, not only that, but I mean, if he gets in an argument with his wife, maybe usually over the children, But the point is that eventually that argument's not going to settle anything. One of those people has got to make a decision that settles it for these people. That's what I'm talking about now, down here. Regardless of what she thinks, it's going to settle it right or wrong. And in other words, it's not going to go on forever. And that when I got married the first time, I had an old boy, an old farmer who lived up the road from us, came to our wedding. And the last thing he told me, he says, remember this, settle all your arguments before you go to bed.
Yeah.
And I thought, you're right.
I got a question from today's generation. How were birthdays celebrated then?
Birthdays?
Yeah.
Oh, the usual thing. Everybody, we had cakes, and usually had all the kids in from the neighborhood, and even we had birthdays for older people. But yeah, a birthday was a big thing. It was usually a big dinner, and always a cake. But yeah, that was. But you got to remember too, in those days, again, we lived kind of isolated, so you made your own pleasures and your fun and everything here. You didn't run up 40 miles up to some restaurant up the road to have a big dinner. You had it right there wherever you were, and it's usually the neighbors and friends and coming around with stuff. But in those days, all of our neighbors were our friends, so you knew everybody in town. Because remember, I come from a small town, so I knew everybody in town. In fact, everybody around for like 20 miles probably. And so not too much went on that somebody didn't know about. Maybe that kept things kind of calmed down too, Because
There was something I was gonna ask before, and I forgot it at the time. But there was actually there's two things I want to ask. But the first one is about when the war broke out and kids were enlisting. We talked about they wanted to basically be a part of it, have a job, and earn a good living. But there was also a level of patriotism that I've kind of observed then versus now. And there's situations that I've read, and I don't have any confirmation on this, I've just read this, that I've heard that in some communities, if someone got a 4F classification, that at least what I've read, that there were times where it was such a blow to that person that some people even ended their own life because they couldn't go off and fight. Did you ever observe that?
well,
Or at least something like
no,
that?
but it affected their life forever. I know particularly two people who were, the one kid was a couple years older than me in high school, Paul Meyer. And Paul got a deferment from the Army. And it just, I don't know how to explain this, but it affected his life with the whole community. It really did. There's always an undercurrent, and it's there forever, that he didn't enlist during the war. I know two guys like that, and they it's hard to explain, but it's just even you go to church together and everything else, but
Yeah.
he he's always kind of an outsider, if you know what I mean.
So now was his deferment, what what were the specifics of that?
Well, it was probably okay. It was probably legal because he was a foreman in General Motors.
Okay. But so his deferment was it was not like he was saying, "Oh, you have a game leg and you can't serve." It was
no.
that's not the same
No, he
as a
just
poor
uh,
he was trying to
lots of
get it.
guys had got deferments in World War II, but they didn't take them.
Okay.
That's the point.
Oh, I see.
Paul took his,
Oh, I got you.
but all the rest of his life, it's hard to explain. It's just one of those things that's kind of when you're like in a group or even in church,
Yeah.
there's that little feeling like he didn't go. He didn't. Everybody else enlisted and went, and he didn't. And it was always there. So he it's hard to explain. It's just one of those things where he was born and raised in that community, but after the war, he was really not part of it.
Interesting.
Uh, in a real, but just enough to make it felt, that you kind of, everybody had the feeling Paul should have gone, because he was healthy. He was nothing wrong. He was got his deferment as a foreman in General Motors, and a lot of guys, not a lot, but several people did that. But afterwards, how do I want to say? He just didn't belong. It's hard to explain, but it's just that it's a lot like.
Would that be similar to like the survivors of the Titanic that we read about? The men that came back weren't treated too well. Is it similar to that?
Well, in a way, but I don't know how to explain it. It's just you kind of have a feeling like, I don't know how to explain it again. It's just like they just didn't do their duty, or didn't, weren't quite good enough, or not, or bad enough, whichever way you want to look at it. And I'm trying to think. There was one other kid. What the heck was his name? Oh yeah, Streeter. And he did the same thing. And I don't know how he got his deferment, but he actually, I should know too. Yes, I do know. He started out as a plumber in town, and then when the war started, his dad owned a big farm. When his dad war started, he went out and back to work on the farm, so he got a farm deferment.
Okay.
Which is even worse than the other guy. And then of course after the war was over with, he went back to plumbing. Had a plumbing business, and he really, you could almost tell if you talked to him, that, I don't know, it's hard to explain. It's something he should have done and didn't do.
Yeah.
That's.
And that's something that we don't really see today.
No, oh no, because nobody, it's no, you don't today. There's, well,
Which is kind of the whole whole point of trying to have these conversations is it's not, the blame isn't on the kid, it's on how they were brought up. At least in terms of when we're trying to compare your generation
Maybe.
and today.
I don't really know. They weren't brought up any different than a lot of other kids.
But you're talking in your whole community, only 2 guys.
Far that I know of, yeah.
So there's a difference there. Whereas if we equate that to today, and there was a draft, what kind of percentage would we expect to see of people trying to get a deferment? It would be,
of course,
a lot different.
Of course, entering into that, you got to remember that probably 80-some% wouldn't even pass. So there you go. That's the truth.
The physical part of it, you mean?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, you got too many fat people today. They wouldn't get in. Well, if they did get in, they'd soon lose it. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be long. But we had, oh man, God, we had an electrician on my second ship, and of course, what we called fat in those days is you'd be skinny today. We actually had a girl we called Fat Fadinsky, but she wasn't really fat. She was a big girl, but compared to today's people, nah. But anyhow, our electrician, he really wasn't fat, but he had a pretty good pod here.
Yeah.
And boy, every time we had a captain's inspection, the captain would come down the line and he'd go, pow. As he'd walk by him, he'd bang him. He'd hit him in the stomach. So it was just, it was kind of funny. But he was actually the fattest person I ever saw, but he really wasn't fat. He had a pretty good sized little paunch on him.
Now, you're familiar with the term PTSD?
With what?
PTSD.
Oh yeah.
So that's what's called today. In your era, it was called something different.
I don't know. We never had it.
Right. Here's my question. I think in the World War II era, they call it shell shock or something like that, or that might have been World War I terminology. But I looked up some statistics recently, and it was just within the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I wanted to see if there was a drastic difference in cases of that post-traumatic stress disorder of your generation versus today. It was pretty alarming what I found. You want to hear it?
Oh, I probably know. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, this came from the government's website, and it's based on studies of people that served in World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, and so I think today, I believe, and I can look it up to verify it, but I believe today, like people that served in the Gulf War, Afghanistan wars, is around 33% of cases observed or people surveyed had some form of PTSD. You go back, previous war was like 29%, and Vietnam War was it was even less. Your era, 3%.
Yeah, I can believe that.
Well, I want to hear your perspective on that. What was different? Because it certainly wasn't.
I can tell you
an
the
easier
difference.
time.
Kinda. How many wars have we won since World War II?
Yeah.
Huh? No, we went into World War II with the idea we had in our minds that we're going in. First of all, this is hard to understand, but you got to there's no way you can understand it, but you have to, if you can, realize that when I enlisted, like all the rest of the guys in World War II, I said goodbye to my parents. I never intended to see them again.
Wow.
Because we had absolutely no idea when that war. You know what my enlistment was? My enlistment was for 1942 and then it said end of the engagement.
Mm.
So I didn't have any end. I was
Yeah.
there till the end of the war.
Wow.
And at that time, we thought the war was going to go forever. We had absolutely no idea. When we went in, most of us went. First of all, keep in mind we had no communication with home in those days. When you wrote a letter home, they got it 6 months later if they were lucky.
Mm.
So we just quit writing. Most people didn't. Now you read a lot of stories about these. I know a lot of guys wrote home, but a lot of guys never did write. I didn't write. I wrote home maybe twice on the whole time I was in the Navy. The first letter I wrote home, I sent it to the what do you call it? Anyhow, the guy that checks the letters over for things that you're not supposed to say,
Okay.
and he brought it back in ribbons. Said he'd cut everything out. So all that you could write in World War II is, "Hello, I am fine. How are you? Goodbye," and that was it. I mean, you couldn't say anything. You couldn't. So
Right.
most guys just quit writing, and plus the fact that we had no idea we were going home again, and so we didn't talk about it. Now these guys that went in afterwards, even the Korean War, had an enlistment time. They knew when they were going to get out.
Okay.
We had no idea, if ever. And as you come on down the line to, you know, kind of look at it this way. Today, you enlist in the Army or the Marines or whatever, or a year ago or two, to go, and you go overseas, and or maybe you don't. But after World War II, every war since then, you knew your enlistment time. So what are you doing the last month, 6 weeks before your time to get out? All you're doing is sitting there waiting for that day to show up when I can get out of this thing.
Mm.
We didn't have anything like that because we weren't ever going to get out.
Mm. That's interesting.
We never talked about home.
Guys
Hardly
were,
ever.
So the other engagements is like guys were always anticipating.
Yeah, exactly.
They're out.
Whatever you've got an end. We had no end. Everything else that you do, you had an end to. You look forward to that end. If I looked forward to the end, I was looking into space. When, And right up until they dropped a bomb, we just figured we was going to be there forever.
Mm.
And so if you haven't done it, you can't conceive it, but you just don't think about something that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, you just, you go on with your life. And, well, for instance, I'll give you a good example. We had at Espiritu Santos over on Aori Island, which was a recreation island, they throw everybody in a boat and take you over there and dump you off on the island. Well, so these guys got over there, and first thing they did was set up a bunch of gambling games again. The guy made a roulette wheel out of some bamboo and stuff and put some numbers on it and took a nail and drove it into a palm tree, and he made quite a bit of money there for a while. He'd spin that thing, and so anyhow, I had my buddy and we was in Espiritu, and we was getting ready to go to, I think, to Guadalcanal, or not Guadalcanal. Don't make any difference. Maybe Guam, I don't know. But anyhow, his buddy of mine and I said, "Geez," he said, "that looks pretty good. We can make some money doing that." And I said, "Yeah, I know. What for?" I don't know, but we'll make some money. So, okay, so he got a piece of canvas from one of the engineers, and we made what they, at that time we called it 7/over underboard. And that we put numbers like 1 to 10 this way and 1 to 10 this way. And I forget exactly how it worked, but anyhow, you'd throw the dice, put down your money and throw the dice, and if you hit one of them, you doubled your money, and I don't know what, I can't remember the game exactly, but it worked something like that. So we had no idea how long we were going to be there at that stupid island. So anyhow, we hauled it over there one day, and we, oh, well, all of us had a lot of money because we couldn't spend any money. I had $3,000-4,000 stuck in my. Everybody had money because for years we've been getting our money and no place to spend it, so we stuck it in our lockers. And so 8 guys come up play. And anyhow, we put $1,000 a piece into this stupid game, and it's. And then there was 4 of us actually we had $4,000, and that's the day when I got $30 a month pay.
That's a lot of money then.
So anyhow, that bosun mate walked up, and of course they had all kinds of beer, and he was really looped. And he walks up there and he reaches in his pocket and starts pulling this money out, and he has about $3,000 or $4,000 in there, and he planks it down there, and he says, "Play that one." Okay, so we threw the dice, and he won. Holy mackerel! We didn't have that kind of money. Oh my God! We thought, "Oh, what are we going to do?" And the next day, he picks up this money, and he looks at it, and he throws it back. He says, "Play it again." It's gone.
Oh, wow.
But that's the way it was then. I mean, money didn't mean nothing. I mean, you're over there, you don't know when you're going home, if ever. Who cares? So, I mean, there was money flying around that island like everywhere. Nobody cared.
I also wonder if, these other wars or engagements we have, like we talked about before, since then, lives have gotten a little more comfortable and cushier. And like, to piggyback on what you were saying, if they're always thinking about when they're going to get to go home, they're also going home to a more comfortable lifestyle than what you guys were used to.
Oh yeah, by far.
So I would imagine that affects the anticipation a little bit.
Well, so much exhilarated from the beginning of the war to the end of the war.
Yeah.
If we hadn't had the war, I always think, I stop and think about it. Like again, when I was a kid, we were living in the 1800s. No cars, horse and buggy, whatever. Now, by the end of the war, and not only that, in the Pacific, we were fighting the war with obsolete planes, planes that would only do 120 miles an hour, all that kind of stuff. I mean, they were what they were. Most of them were civilian planes converted to military, and then it got up until the very last. We had the last 4 months in whatever, we finally got 6 new P-61s with radar. We could have used 4 years before that. But we didn't have it. So what I'm saying is things accelerated so fast from here to here.
Yeah.
If it hadn't been for the war, we probably wouldn't have moved that fast. We probably wouldn't have had all that stuff. Penicillin. What did I say? It was penicillin. Anyway, in 1943, my buddy, two of my buddies and I got off the ship on Guadalcanal, and we went ashore, and here was a little native boy standing there about that tall, and we walked up to him, and we had brought a skivvy shirt and a pair of GI shoes. I think they were size 10s, and a white hat. And we offered it to him. And he said, we finally got to him to get him to take us to where he lived, which he lived on a mountaintop about 5 miles up the mountain in the jungle. And I can't remember how we got him. I think we had another native there that could translate. I don't remember. Anyhow, so we started. He said, "Yeah, oh yeah, he'd take us up." So we started out. So he puts these shoes on. He's clomping along there and running ahead of us. And of course, he couldn't get that far. So eventually, he'd get behind us. He'd take them off and hold on to strings, and he'd run up ahead of us. And we'd put them back on. He'd go for a while, and pretty soon he's back here again. So we did that all the way up the mountain. So we're going through this stupid jungle, and I don't know, we're about halfway up and pushing our way. Because you got to understand the jungle. You don't walk through it. You push your way through it, right? And we were hoping this kid knew where he was going. We got about halfway up, and we come to a clearing just like this, and here's a bunch of little huts. And we stood there and looked a while, and there was a row of stones across the path. And this kid had gotten way behind us by that time. And so we stepped over the stone, started walking in there, and holy mackerel, a big black boy come running around with a spear like this and hollering and yelling at us. And we just backed up until we got back over the stones, And he stopped there shaking this spear and hollering. We didn't know what he was doing. Finally, the kid comes up here and he finally gets it to us that these stones are a gate. And you can't cross that gate. It's closed. The gate was closed. But we didn't know that. So anyhow, we got that all straightened out through this kid. And finally, this guy let us go through the village. And we started up the mountain again, and another hour or two, and we're plodding along through the jungle, and we come out to this village up on top of a mountain. And those people hadn't seen a white man in I don't know how long. They were exactly like what you see pictures of, just natives. And there was shrunken heads all over in the village, on the walls, and the big they all got a drum down there. Boy, I remember that. At night, boom, 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 boom. But anyhow, so I still got it at home. I got 3 stone images from them, gods, and my buddy got a shrunken head. He brought it home. I thought afterwards, I wish I'd have gotten one, but I didn't. I got the stone images. I still got the one.
Did they just give that to you guys, or did you have to trade some
No,
for it?
we always had a pocket full. We found out that they like shiny money. They wouldn't take anything. You could give them $1,000 in bills, and they'd just burn it.
Yeah.
What they wanted was nickels and quarters, because they were shown, and they bore a hole in them. Of course, they had them things in their noses and around their chests and all over. They bore a hole in them, and so we'd take nickels and dimes and quarters, and you could give them like a handful, And anyhow, we got all that stuff, and oh boy, it started getting dark, and we decided we better head back down the mountain. Well, the kid decided he's going to stay home. Now, we didn't know how to get out of that dumb place, so we thought, well, we couldn't talk him out of it. He's going to stay home. So we took off by just the 3 of us. we stumbled through that stupid jungle into this and into that, fell in the water, fell in everything, and finally got about halfway down. We came across an old hut that was sitting alongside the trail, and so we laid down in that, slept all night, got up in the morning. It was dawn. Here we are in the middle of the jungle. I didn't know where the ship was or where the bay was. And so we just started down the mountain again. And pretty soon we come out on a promontory, kind of out like this, at halfway down. And you could look way down and see the bay. And luckily our ship was sitting there. All they had done was gone over to another island and delivered some. Well, they went over there for the not penicillin, huh? Sulfur drug.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's the first time we'd ever had anything like that. Oh man, down there if you got a cut, that thing wouldn't heal forever. It'd be weeks. You know, it'd keep.
Fussing.
Yeah, just white pus and everything. So we got that darn sulfur drug, man. You spread it on there. Oh my goodness, it was good. A couple of days, you all healed up. But ringworm, oh my gosh, right there, everywhere. We used to take iodine. We had these iodine applicators. We'd dip with iodine, and in a couple of hours, that iodine would get real dry, and we'd pick all the skin off. Then you'd put another one on and wait for that to dry, and then pick all that off. Then you put another one on, and the third time it would stay pretty good.
Wow.
Yeah. But anyhow, enough of that. we didn't. You don't realize we just didn't have. We had iodine.
Sulfur.
Huh?
Sulfur.
Sulfur? No. Oh, yeah, that white salve. I don't know. We put everything we had to put white salve on. You know, I can't remember. But you know, first the war, there was no drugs. That is just the same medicine we'd had for years and years and years. So, if you got sick, you was sick forever.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So I think to wrap this up, the things that we've established is enduring a little bit of tougher times is kind of better in the long run. I think we've kind of established some of that. Loving your kids, and then what are the two things you got out of it?
Love and rules, right?
Love and rules.
Yeah,
And it's a lot better because one thing you mentioned really quick was you got to start early. Preventative is a lot better than trying to fix something that's already gone astray.
Yeah, you can't. I don't know. It's hard to explain. When you grow up with something that's there, it's just natural. You can, it's hard to explain it. I mean, that love between a parent and a child, or whatever, you don't make it. It makes itself.
Yeah.
It grows, and
well, I think we kind of just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, what would you say in next year when you turn 102, you come back and we do this again?
I don't know if she'll let me.
Well, George, I want to thank you so much.
Well,
for sitting down with us.
It was fun.
Yeah.
It's always interesting going back. In some ways, I have to go back out in the world, but no, it was enjoyment.
All right. Well, we'll do it again for sure.
Thank you, George.
Good.
We
You're
honor
welcome.